we're now discovering a lot of things in the so-called Mueller report are absolutely false. You know, it's literally breaking, and his key assertions in this document of his, 448 pages, are not accurate at all. You know, the report describes Paul Manafort's Ukrainian business partner as a shady individual with ties to Russian intelligence. In other words, the Mueller report wanted you to believe that the Trump campaign was essentially in bed with a Russian spy. But John Solomon breaks the story, and what do we find out? That we knew it was total BS, and Manafort's business partner was actually a sensitive intelligence source, but for the U.S. State Department. And how and why Team Mueller purposely deceived we, the people, is beyond my imagination. It's probably likely one of the reasons Mueller doesn't dare want to go before Nadler's committee and face Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows. In fact, in this case, the guy had visited the U.S. twice in 2016 to meet with State Department officials. He regularly met with the chief political officer inside the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, and Mueller had access to all that information, which means that this was a premeditated lie. And yet he cast a dark shadow on this individual to present this person as a nefarious actor tied to Russia. It wasn't true. And the very same plan, by the way, that was given to the Trump campaign in 2016, a Ukrainian peace plan, well, that was presented to the Obama administration. Well, that context should have been in the Mueller report also, because Mueller's team knew it. So another example of outright deception. And just the latest in what is a pretty disturbing pattern. I mean, the deceptively edited transcript from the former Trump attorney, John Dowd, during a privileged routine call. Remember, in the case, they had a joint defense agreement with General Flynn, and Mueller conveniently leaves out John Dowd's statement that his request for communication was, quote, not only for the president, but for the country, and that he was not asking for any confidential information, which was the exact opposite of what the Mueller team portrayed. And in other words, exculpatory evidence was ripped right out of it, which is classic Andrew Weissman, if you read License to Lie by Sidney Powell. And you can't forget all that and not come to a conclusion is that they purposely wrote this report, withholding knowledge, altering knowledge, just to make it look as bad as they could. John Solomon, who broke this story, is with us now. There's no way they didn't know what they were doing, John, because this was easily found out by them.
Well, listen, what I have is actually a section of the Mueller team's files. These are actually Robert Mueller's files. They include FBI interviews that the Robert Mueller team did with State Department officials who worked on a daily basis with this Manafort partner named Konstantin Klemennik. I have the cables and the emails in which State Department officials on a daily basis relayed valuable intelligence that came in from Mr. Klemennik to the ambassador at the Ukraine embassy in Kiev, to officials in Washington and among themselves. And I have all the emails that Mr. Klemennik sent to his handlers at the State Department. And he wasn't just dealing with any old person at the State Department. He dealt with the deputy chief of mission and the two chief political officers for the embassy. So he was such a valued asset that he was handled at the highest levels of the State Department. And one of the things that are in the documents really clear, the State Department officials told the FBI they made a conscious effort never to put Mr. Klemennik's name in any cables for fear that WikiLeaks would get a hold of him and his identity as a secret source for the United States government would be compromised. So that was all sitting in Mueller's files. No doubt about it, confirmed it by interviews, by the markings on the documents. Robert Mueller had that side of Konstantin Klemennik's life nailed down. And for reasons that I don't understand, and I have not been able to ascertain through reporting, Robert Mueller chose to portray Konstantin Klemennik as a Russian sympathist, somebody who had connections to the Russian intelligence group, the Russian intelligence services, without telling this entire other story. And I think that it disserves the public. If the goal of the Mueller report was to get transparency, the failure to mention this vast body of evidence that portrays Klemennik in a very different light, trusted by the United States government, giving valuable information.
By the way, doesn't the same thing exist now? We know that Carter Page was an American asset, that he worked for the intelligence community? It's not. I mean, I asked him straight up, and he said, well, it's out there. Yeah, I was working for our side.
Yeah, when that was in March of 16, as recently as March of 2016, just as he was joining the Trump campaign. It has now been verified by the FBI documents I obtained and others that Carter Page was working to help the FBI bring a case against Russian mobsters. So all of these missing elements always have a common pattern. The common pattern is they make the person close to Trump look dirtier, closer to Rush, more problematic than the actual evidence. And let me give you one example from the Konstantin Klementyk documents that just gives a sense of how misleading by omission the Mueller report is. The Mueller report makes a big deal out of the fact that Konstantin Klementyk, in August of 2016, came to New York. Now, that's a sign he's not a Russian spy, because if he's a Russian spy, we wouldn't have given him a visa. He gets in the country. He drops off a peace plan to try to settle the Russia-Ukraine crisis in Crimea. And the Mueller says, oh, my gosh, this is an example of him doing the Russians' bidding, and he was trying to influence Trump and get Trump involved in this matter. There's only one problem with that story. If you go through the FBI documents and the cables and the State Department memos that Bob Mueller possessed in his hands, Klementyk first delivered the peace plan to the Obama administration 4 months before he gave it to Trump. So he gave it to both parties. And how did the Obama administration react to it? State Department official thanked him, saying, this is very valuable information. We're noodling it over. If you have that part of the report, all of us, and you knew that part of Konstantin Klementyk, you'd go, well, why am I so worried about the contact with Donald Trump? It sounds like he was trying to get everybody aboard in solving the Ukraine crisis. All of that's omitted, and it's always omitted to the negativity of the Trump campaign. The portrayal of the negative of the Trump campaign is always more negative when there's an omission here. I think the American public have to ask why.
Well, I mean, you literally looked at hundreds of pages of government documents that we know that Robert Mueller possessed since 2018, and
that's right.
And they knew the demarcation. They knew the sensitive intelligence source that was this guy Klementyk, and they were aware that he worked for the State Department and who informed on matters involving Ukraine and Russia, and it was such an incomplete and deceptive portrayal of such an important person, and they used it in this overall narrative. Right. And to me, there's only one conclusion, is they wanted it to be interpreted the wrong way, and they purposely wrote it to be interpreted the wrong way. And I honestly think it just shows, and by the way, there's a poll out that confirms this. Half of Americans now believe that Trump was a victim of a witch hunt. And it also confirms my belief that Robert Mueller does not want to testify. And I don't think he will testify, because I don't think he can sustain the questioning of Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows and company.
Well, it'll be, I think Ken Starr said on your show last night, it would be a travesty for the American public if Mueller got away and didn't answer these very seminal questions that go to the credibility of his investigation, the credibility of his findings, and the honesty of the work that he said. And I remember something Ken said last night, Judge Starr said on your show. It was very important. He said when Bob Mueller made that 9-point statement, he emphasized that this investigation was built on the integrity of good people who worked with him. That integrity is now in question. That work is now in question. Why wouldn't Bob Mueller come and answer the questions that would allow us to assess what went on? Well,
he can't answer why he hired these people. He can't answer when he knew there was no collusion. He can't answer why such a biased team. He can't answer questions like, why did you have time for taxi medallions and FARA violations, but not Hillary's dirty Russian dossier? All right, stay right there, John.
Back to the Sean Hannity Show.
The question for each of us to answer, especially you graduates, is will the symbol of this troubled age be the cynic's shrug, or will it be the raised hand of the volunteer, the activists' rolled-up sleeves, the linked arms and marching feet of people who demand justice and democracy? The answer is up to all of us.
All right, 25 now till the top of the hour. Hillary, I mean, if you want to talk about one individual really out of touch, it would be her. We just told you in the last half hour about John Solomon, investigative reporter, executive vice president at The Hill, and, all the inconsistencies that he found in the Mueller report that purposely were designed because they had the information to create a false narrative, false image a deception, frankly, a lie about Donald Trump and about certain individuals to make it appear as something it's not. Posing as, Russian asset when, in fact, they knew it was a State Department asset. These are big deals, and they knew the truth, but they didn't print the truth. That is really troublesome and should be troublesome to every American. John has also written a column that I think needs a lot more attention than it's gotten, and it's called Hillary Clinton's Russia Collusion IOU and the Answer She Owes America. Now, the column ends with 10 very specific questions that Hillary Clinton does need to answer, but the pattern of political IOUs paid to the Clinton Foundation, it's not just the Uranium One deal, where she sat on the board that made the decision, even though we had an FBI spy inside of Putin's network here in America, because Putin wanted a foothold in our uranium market. Uranium, of course, the base raw materials for nuclear weapons. We don't have enough uranium to make our own nuclear weapons. We even have to import uranium. And why we would ever sign off on giving 20% to a hostile regime and a hostile actor, again, Putin, is beyond anybody's comprehension. And just prior to that deal happening, Bill Clinton got paid twice his normal speaking fee. He wanted to meet with nuclear regulators in Russia, but instead had an audience with Putin himself. And, the bank that was involved in the Uranium One deal, well, they're the ones that were paying for Bill Clinton's speech. And she votes, even though we had William Campbell, FBI spy, undercover, Putin's network discovered in America, involved in bribery and kickbacks, money laundering, extortion, and still Hillary was one of that board's 9 people to approve the deal, and over time $145 million made its way back to the Clinton Foundation. John, before we get to the questions, you write every specific example here, and it's actually a frightening scenario and case that you're building that pay to play was at the highest level by the Clintons.
Yeah, listen, it's well documented. It's not even in doubt anymore. In fact, it wasn't even in doubt when she took over Secretary of State, because the State Department was so worried by the pattern of money flowing in from people who had business pending before her when she was a senator. They made her sign a special agreement like that no other Secretary of State had ever signed before, in which the Clinton Foundation would abstain from doing certain things and be transparent about where they got their money from. It turns out that they made those promises. They signed that letter. But as you know from earlier reporting I did, there were millions of dollars the Clinton Foundation hid from foreign contributors that were only found by, things like when I found the Norwegian slush fund a few years back. So we know that the State Department even had this fear before she took over. The pattern is clear. It's never been fully investigated by an investigative body, and I think for some on the right that is a frustrating thing. But I think the more important question now is, it has been 18 months since we first learned belatedly that Hillary Clinton funded the Christopher Steele dossier, the one that prompted the FBI to get the FISA. And she has not been asked a single question or answered a single question from a media member. She has not faced a single subpoena from a congressional committee. We're unaware of any grand jury subpoenas. And the point of my column was, it is time for her to answer these questions. When did she know that Christopher Steele was taking this political opposition research dirt and weaponizing it by going to the FBI? What did she know about Sidney Blumenthal and Cody Scherer talking to the State Department? What did she know about her lawyer going to James Baker and dumping more Trump dirt? Those are questions that she has escaped any scrutiny from, and I tried to put these questions out there in hopes that someone will soon one day ask her them.
Well, there's not going to be anybody in the media. I tried
That's
in
for sure.
vain. Imagine if Donald Trump had ever started his political career in the home of unrepentant domestic terrorists, part of the Weather Underground, that were responsible and took responsibility for bombing the Pentagon, the Capitol, and New York City Police Headquarters. How many questions do you think Barack Obama was asked, having started his career in the home of Ayers and Dorgan? Just guess. How many do you think?
I would guess none.
Nope, there was one.
Wow.
One question. It came from George Stephanopoulos, and it came as a result of George being on this radio program the day before he was hosting a debate. And when I actually played it, I said, George, well, are you going to ask him about Ayers and Dorn? He goes, well, who are they? I said, George, do you read newspapers? They are the unrepentant terrorists. He started his career in their home. They live in that area of Chicago. And he goes, I didn't know that. And I said, 9/11, 2001, New York Times, Bill Ayers is quoted as saying, again, this is the day we're attacked, that early morning edition.
There are two questions that I don't think anybody has asked Barack Obama, and I don't know if this is going to be on your list tomorrow. One is the only time he's ever been asked about his association with Bill Ayers, the unrepentant terrorist from the Weather Underground, who on 9/11 of all days in the New York Times was saying, I don't regret setting bombs. I don't think we did enough. When asked about it by the Politico, David Axelrod said they have a friendly relationship and that they had done a number of speeches together and that they sat on a board together. Is that a question you might ask?
Well, I'm taking notes right now.
September 11, 2001, of all days, there was an article in the New York Times, and there are a number of quotes about Bill Ayers, and the Politico had in there the comments about from David Axelrod. I think that's an interesting question that nobody in the media has really brought up. We've highlighted a little bit more here on this program, but let me see if I can help you. You want any more questions?
Yeah, keep going.
The Chicago Reader talked about and commented, has
all
comments
right,
of Barack Obama.
But he asked the question to his credit, but the fact that he didn't know and the flimsy answer was, well, he's just a guy in the neighborhood, George, and nobody ever asked again. And their relationship was, we found out later, far more extensive than anybody ever knew.
Yeah, well, I think, as I've said many times, curiosity in my profession in the media has really waned. You don't see reporters read up as well. You don't see them asking the tough questions, and you don't see them following up or sticking with the story long enough to get to the truth, with the exception of the Russia case, where we did the opposite. The media spent a long time telling a story that ended up not being true at all. But I think in general, that curiosity that gave us reporters like Woodward and Bernstein and important Pulitzer Prize projects in the 80s and the 90s, it seems to be waning. There seems to be an acceptance of talking points, and people seem to be more focused on whether someone's been called nasty in an interview who's just a pop culture figure, rather than really focusing on the meritorious policy issues and political ethics issues that dominate Washington. And I think it's a real problem for the industry. I'm still committed to doing it. There's a small group of us every day I see around town that still want to do it the old-fashioned way. But there's a gap in the journalism profession. There's a failure, and it's been about 10, 12 years in the making now, of asking hard questions and really, in a bipartisan, neutral way, getting to the truth of difficult stories like political ethics.
All right, quick break. We'll come back more with the Executive Vice President, investigative reporter for The Hill, John. All right, as we continue with investigative reporter, Executive Vice President for The Hill, John Solomon, how do you explain that the 99.9% of media in this country is basically an extension of all things Democratic Party? They never vetted Obama. They never gave out his 8-year record, and when you give it out, it's atrocious. They, in this particular case, they went along with and disseminated night after night lies, misinformation, propaganda. They had hysteria and glee in their voice on the nights that they thought that they got the president once and for all. It turns out none of it was true. But people like you and Greg and Sarah and Joe and Victoria, I can't name everybody. All these people, I call the ensemble cast, have put together a story of unprecedented abuse of power and corruption, a rigged presidential candidate investigation. Then we had we had a rigged primary. Nobody cared about Bernie. They tried to rig a presidential election. They spied on an opposition party campaign based on Russian lies that one party paid for by purposely misleading and willfully misleading and committing a fraud on FISA courts. And they used it to bludgeon then candidate Trump, then Trump transition team Trump, and then Trump the president. And all of it happened, and nobody paid attention to any of it, except for a few of us.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I do see signs now that people are looking back and finding some of the stories they missed. It's a slow process. I think before it's all done, particularly because of Bill Barr, the entire media will ultimately cover the final findings, and that'll be good for the country. But, I've always said this, and when I guest teach at journalism schools, you are a function of the people you talk to. And if you only talk to one party, if you only talk to one type of source, even in the intelligence community, if you only talk to the CIA, CIA and you don't talk to the FBI, you're in danger of getting hijacked by one person's perspectives. And the greatest weapon journalists have to stay in the center, to be neutral, is to talk to as many people as possible. Today, reporters are more concerned about their next tweet and their next television appearance, and they're not really having that bipartisan communication that can give you a complete story. And I think that's one of the great tragedies in our industry. We've become a hostage to small groups of sources we hang out with, and we're not surveying the entire sky and trying to get to the truth.
Well, let me ask you this, because the swamp, the sewer that is Washington, D.C., it's a very incestuous culture. I mean,
sure.
You have people in congressional offices, Senate offices, lobbyists, then you have staffers of lobbying groups, and they all go to dinner together, and
that's right.
A lot of them date each other, and, you know, they're just all friendly with each other, and it's like they all believed a big lie, and it wasn't hard to figure out. Now, I know you did a lot of digging, and you made a lot of phone calls, and I did the same, and everybody else that was part of this group did the same. Our desire was to get to the truth, but fairly early on, we knew that this was not true.
No, there's no doubt.
And yet it became the narrative, and frankly, they came much closer than I feel comfortable with ever knowing, really damaging and destroying a duly elected president.
Yeah. You know, my dad was a law enforcement officer for 46 years, eventually became police chief, but he ran the Detective Bureau in Connecticut for a long, long time. And he had two rules, and I've tried to adapt them to journalism. I think they're really great. Never become hostage to your witnesses, or in our case, never become hostage to your sources. Always try to keep independence from them. Don't get too close, because the danger is you'll miss something when that closeness. And then I think the second thing you used to always say is follow the evidence, don't define the evidence, meaning don't come to a theory and then look at the evidence, because you can always manipulate the evidence to come to your theory. Follow the evidence until you get to the truth. And he had that his whole life, and he was such a great detective. He broke some of the biggest murder cases in American history, and it was because he kept that neutrality and independence. I think a lot of what he practiced in his career could really be practiced in journalism a lot better. It's certainly been at my thing. I'm always curious, but I never let people try to tell me what to write. I try to follow the facts, and then after I have the facts, write it. Too much today is that we see reporters telling a story.
Do you get criticized for it? Do people look down on you? Do you get attacked? I mean, there were friends of mine that come on your show and they go, yeah, we pay a price being friends with you, Hannity.
Yeah, listen, absolutely. There's been a lot of controversy about the amount of time I've spent on your shows. There's a lot of controversy about the early on when I took on these stories and I was rowing against basically the tide of the rest of journalism. The good thing about that is I really don't care about all that feedback. I care about getting to the truth. And, people can look back at my career. There was a period of time where I had the same sort of treatment. It was right after 9/11 when I reported a lot of the stories of what the FBI and the Bush administration knew before 9/11. And, of course, that was an unpopular story. Everyone in the media we were sucker punched. Well, no, the FBI missed a big opportunity.
Hey, listen. The 9/11 Commission report nailed it. They were at war with us. We were not at war with them.
That's right.
Kenya, Tanzania, the first
Cole.
Trade Center bombing, the USS Cole. I'm sorry. They were telling us they were at war, and we didn't listen. We did not listen. All right, John Solomon, great job on this. Let's keep getting to